Chapter 3, Section 4, the second part, we're going to talk about proportions. So a proportion is an equation that states two ratios are equal. And we're going to find proportions by using something called a cross product. And that's the process of multiplying the numbers diagonally in a proportion. So by the end of this part of the lesson, you should be able to solve proportions. A proportion is an equation that states that two ratios are equal. So we have two ratios there, A over B and C over D, and we're saying that they're equal to each other. We have to say this part here, that B can't equal 0 and D can't equal 0, because remember, if you divide by 0, bad things happen. So if I want to solve each proportion, we're basically trying to figure out what value of x would make this true. So something over 8 is exactly the same thing as 5 over 6. So solve it just like you would any other equation that we've been doing. 8's being divided by x, so the opposite would be to multiply both sides by 8. So that crosses off. And then remember, we have several options when we're multiplying fractions. You could multiply straight across and get 5 times 8, which is 40 over 6, and then simplify. Or remember, you could simplify here first. 2 goes into 6 3 times, and it goes into 8 4 times. So you'd end up with 20/3, which is exactly what we will get when we simplify. So 20/3 divided by 8 is the exact same thing as 5/6. Do the same thing for the next one. We're trying to get y by itself to figure out y, or something divided by 12, is going to equal 4 divided by 7. So just like the last one, I'm going to multiply both sides by 12. Crosses off. We can't simplify this one, so we just have to multiply the top and multiply the bottoms. So y is 48/7. And then last one, just because the m's on this side of the equation doesn't change anything, we're going to multiply both sides by 15. I would definitely simplify this one before I broke out my calculator. So I look at 15 and 50, and I know that 5 can go into both of them. Goes into this one 3 times, goes into this one 10. And then you could even do 18 divided by 10. Both of them are even, so we know 2 goes into it 9 times, and 2 goes into this 5 times. So you'd end up with 3 times 9, which is 27, over 5. So m equals 27/5. So hopefully those are pretty easy. And we're going to try a different way to solve them. You can also do something called a cross product. And that's when you multiply things diagonally. So we'd multiply like x times 12, and we'd multiply 4 times 25. And then we can solve this nice pretty equation. And it doesn't really matter. We could have multiplied both sides by 4 and we would have ended up with exactly the same thing for this. But when we get to ones like this over here, part C, because the d's in the denominator, it's going to be a lot easier if we do cross products. So if I divide this, 112, they both have a 4 in common. 4 goes into 12 3 times, and into this 25 times. So we get 25/3. Let's skip B and jump right to C since we talked about it. So now if I wanted to get this by itself the other way, I would have to multiply both sides by D and then divide both sides by this fraction over here. So cross products makes our life a lot easier because all we have to do is multiply stuff across. So I get D times 72, and then 54 times 64 equals 3, 4, 5, 6. And then to solve for D, all we gotta do is divide both sides by 72. That rhymed. And when we do that, we end up with 48. And then you can always check these. Plug it back in. Is 54 over 48 the same thing as 72 over 64? If you do 54 divided by 48, I end up with 1.125. And 72 divided by 64 is also 1.125. So because these are equal, I know I have the right answer. So let's do a problem. A box of cereal weighs 354 grams and it contains 20 grams of fat. Find the number of grams of fat and the recommended serving size of only 55 grams. So we have two things we're talking about here. We have weight and we have fat. And we're going to turn that into a ratio. And because they're both grams, it's a ratio and not a rate. And it doesn't really matter which one's on top or bottom as long as we keep it consistent. So we have the whole box. That's one of our situations. And then we have the serving size. So in the whole box, the weight is 354 grams, and the amount of fat is 20 grams of fat. And now in the serving size, we're only supposed to eat 55 grams, and I don't know how much fat it has. So I can turn this into a proportion. That 354 over 20 has to equal 55 over x. And then using our cross products like we just did, we can solve. So 20 times 55 is going to give us 1,100. And if we multiply 354 times x, we get exactly that. And then all we have to do is divide both sides by 354. And we end up with x equals 3.11 grams. Now stop and make sure your answer makes sense. Does it make sense that this is a smaller number? Well, yeah, because we're not eating the whole box of cereal. So you always got to go through and check and make sure that your answer makes sense. Don't just blindly box up a number just because that's what your calculator spit out. So now let's move to some hard ones. These ones look a little funny just because they have x plus 2 or y minus 15, but we can solve these exactly the same way. Now this is where cross products really come in handy, because I can turn these two fractions into a nice easy equation that I know how to solve. So I do 14 times x, and then I do 10 times x plus 2. And now we can solve this. I have to distribute over here, move all my x's to one side, and then divide by 4. So I get x equals a nice pretty 5. And then double check that this works. Plug it back in. So I'd end up with 5 plus 2 divided by 14 on one side, and I want to know if that equals 5 divided by 10. Well, 5 plus 2 is really 7. And 7 over 14 is definitely equal to 1/2. So I know that this is true. These are going to be solved exactly the same way. Let's skip B and jump to C again. Multiply both sides. So I get 5 times w plus 6. You got to be really careful. You need those parentheses there because you're saying that whatever's down here has to be multiplied by 5. And same thing here, whatever is on top needs to be multiplied by everything on bottom, so we need some parentheses again. And now we get to solving. So I'm going to distribute on both sides. And then this is why we did the solving stuff before we jumped into proportions, because you need it for all of this stuff. And then we have to subtract 30 from both sides. Watch your signs here. This gives me 2w equals a negative 42. And then if I divide both sides by 2, I end up with a negative 21. And just like the last one, and just like all of these problems, you can always plug it in and check. So make sure you do that, especially on a test or a quiz. So that's it. You should be able to solve proportions. I gave you a nice easy one here, and then one that's a little bit harder. And we will go over these tomorrow in class. Make sure you write down any questions you have, and have a good night.